So this is 08:35 hours GMT in the morning of Tuesday, the 13th of October 2020. So we have on the table the following Fleet Street titles, print titles that we are looking at today. The Guardian, I newspaper, The Times, The Daily Express, The Financial Times, The Daily Mail, The Daily Borisgraph, Daily Mirror, Daily Star, and Murdoch Scum. Now, Murdoch Scum is doing a very funny front page splash today, which is very opportunistic and very kind of deceptive, but at the same time it's a pun. It's a pun on the United Kingdom, and it is deceptively kind of recognizing the impact of Boris Johnson being at the front of the cabal, and the cabal being in occupation of the places of power in this country. So most of the critics of Johnson, based on his utterances over the years, generally, and his utterances against Scotland, against Ireland, against people of Merseyside, have said repeatedly that he is breaking up the UK, and the Brexit was an instrument to break up the United Kingdom. And the scum has always supported Johnson. It has been playing kind of not knowing what the impact of the Brexiteering lies and liars has been on the so-called United Kingdom. So this is the first time that Rupert Murdoch scum is using this phrase that actually reflects much more substance away from the handling or mishandling of the coronavirus crisis than it would appear. And this is the topical, opportunistic headline that the scum is running in full knowledge that almost all the other papers in Fleet Street are critical of Boris Johnson on this one. So we shall be taking a look at that a bit more extensively. And the Star is doing the Joker kind of journalism. It is saying, we are back to square one, and Boris Johnson is being shown as a dummy. And it says, after 204 days, we are back to square one, and Boris Johnson is being shown as completely out of his depth. It is important to put this state of affairs in Latin, I think. None of them has done that. Probably we shall show them the way, and we shall do a dummy headline in Latin so that it reflects Boris Johnson's overstated scholarship. How he is credited with any of this scholarship is beyond the evidence. But that is what, and this picture or this kind of look is shared more or less by today's papers, including the Guardian and the Guardian and the Times. So let's have the Times, and and then the Guardian. This look, the Boris Graf has got compelled to put that headline and that picture grim. Now, we said at the weekend that the Murdoch scum was using the pun grim up north as a kind of talking down to the people of the north and taking a mick that is ridiculing them and kind of slighting their accent and their kind of culture of the up north. So this is the kind of three images of the three persons in the news in this context. And the image of Johnson is the same as the image put on the front pages of the Times, as well as the Guardian and the Boris Graf. And this is an admission, it's a compelled admission. And although the lying Beaverbrook Desperate Daily Express is using a different picture, it's not a picture of the Churchillian celebration that it is prone to peddle at the slightest excuse, overhyping Boris Johnson and his weight and his gravitas. He has none. And in the picture that is on the front page of this Financial Times, where Johnson is looking at Sunak, the UK finance minister in the Johnson-fronted cabal of a cabinet, Johnson is looking really grim and glum and unhappy. Observers would say that Johnson is showing what most of the people have already realized in the context of the kind of role that the Treasury has been playing or been forced to play, pretending to be doing various relief measures to mitigate the impact of the virus on the economy, so forth. Now, these are the papers, these are the headlines, but the essential narrative in all of these is that this one is again another forced kind of confession by the Boris peddling, right-wing peddling over Brexiteering, Daily Crook's mail. Now, all the hype and the propaganda and the publicity and the excusing of Boris Johnson's failures over the last 30 years, unreliability, as he has been kind of pushing himself up the political grease pole by lying. His main means has been lying and deception and fraud and pretension. The Daily Mail has been one of the Fleet Street lying publications, that are mass circulation so-called, which has been telling its gullible millions that Boris Johnson is what the country needs and what the gullibles need. And the main person who has been responsible for that lying narrative for Johnson has been, of course, Paul Dacre, the dire, disastrous Paul Dacre, who is now lined up to be installed at Ofcom, the broadcasting regulator outlet or outfit. We shall be talking more about the role of the Ofcom over the years, and this is in the context of what we have been saying. This is exclusive world, exclusive diagnosis of the Fleet Street papers coming from the Khoodeelaar campaign. Khoodeelaar campaign, established in December 2003 to defend the community in Brick Lane and in the rest of the East End of London, immediately addressing the attack of the big business agenda against the East End as fronted and peddled by the frontage or facade of the Cross London train line called Crossrail. And we have said things, we have unearthed evidence, and we have shared our findings. We don't run a paywall on any of our kind of platforms, either on Facebook or on Twitter or any other. So we have been sharing the fruits of very hard work and extreme, unique investigation for the sake of simple sake of knowledge and authenticity and integrity and transparency and accountability and democracy and equality. We have not charged anything of anyone. But one thing we do, we don't recruit friends for the Facebook account, nor do we follow friends. And as we have said, the simple statement is that this is just for the record what we publish. The fact that we don't have followers and we don't follow on our Facebook account or accounts does not in any way make our publications and our posts any different or any less significant. As everyone knows, every objectively defined student of current events and current commentary and current activities knows it doesn't have to be a platform that is followed by any number of persons. The fact of its existence is what matters, and the contents of the platform are what matter. So that's what we're doing. And in this KhoodeelaarTV platform, we are doing exactly that. And we are doing it as we say every day, we are doing the diagnosis. And that is what is more important than any of the equivalents or counterparts that are available and at great cost to the public and to individuals who access them in various ways, available via the taxpayers funded BBC, that is license fee taxpayers, and by the commercially subsidized and commercially purchased Sky News. Now, as to Channel 4, which doesn't have a press review slot that it used to have, and we shall talk about that later, it doesn't have a kind of press review or look at the press every day or even periodically. The ITB has a version, but the ITB, as the campaign against the ITB in the 1970s proved, ITB has always been a corrupt broadcaster and outlet. And details of the corruption is contained in the actual contents and the context of the ITB's broadcasts and the bias that the ITB broadcasts contain and represent and embody and typify. So what we are doing is the unique examination of Fleet Street British newspapers as defined by their location and the political affiliations as based in London, which is next to the, quote, Westminster Parliament. There are local papers in local cities like Sheffield and Birmingham, and other less kind of populous cities and towns. But they don't represent an independent political agenda or narrative. With a slight and occasional exception of the paper or papers coming out of Wales, none of the papers in Birmingham or Leeds or Sheffield or any other town, Manchester, represent an alternative or independent kind of approach. So what this is doing, this is actually being echoed and imitated by the papers in the rest of England. Not talking about Scotland just this minute, but we'll be doing shortly. The political agenda is the same because the papers are owned by criminally motivated business interests and business gangs whose purpose in publishing is not to support democracy or to reflect democracy or accountability or equality or justice or universality or any of the values that we support and actually uphold and stand up for, and values, more importantly, that are needed very badly by this society and every society. And the fact that these papers are still in denial of those values and are opposing and those values, are hostile to those values, sums up the reason why the world has landed or been exposed or caught in a mess about handling this pandemic. Despite all the huge amounts of money being spent in denying the existence of society, the criminals are actually forced to recognize the existence of society just for their business. Because if they don't recognize the areas like the North, which is what they are shedding crocodile tears this morning and this weekend, they would not have a clientele, they would not have a market, they would not have people paying for their papers. As simple as that. But apart from the contents, which are opportunistic and commercially, kind of dishonestly, kind of structured and scripted, the real thrust of their agenda remains the same, which is to push the interests of big business, of which they are parts, but not all the owners of the newspapers are equally as big as the others. Like, for example, Rupert Murdoch is a billionaire, and the others in competition with him are not in possession of as much resource as he is. But apart from that, when it comes to the real kind of bottom line, it is all the newspapers, including The Guardian, are supporters of the, broadly speaking, right and opponents, broadly speaking, of the left. And as we have said before, the substance of the left in Britain in politics is itself questionable. But even if it is questionable, there is a notional, theoretical case for the left to prevail in politics for the simple reason of demanding balance and answers to questions that are relevant to the lives of the people who are in poor income and low income and no income and are subjects of daily discrimination, denial, and lack of access. So when the Daily Mail says back to the bad old days, it is reflecting unspoken, because they are not speaking. Because they are not speaking, that is to say, the Daily Mail is not giving them any voice, but all the people that have been condemning the ultra-right cabal fronted by Johnson. That is the reflection, because the evidence is now so complete and compelling that even the Daily Mail, which has been blindly peddling the lying lines of Johnson and his co-liars, is left with no alternative as a quote newspaper but to admit this. So let's read the first couple of paragraphs. Boris Johnson last night plunged millions more into local lockdowns and warned that even tougher restrictions could follow. A third of the population will be living under stricter curbs from tomorrow, that is Wednesday, when local measures will be extended to cover 22 million, and 9 million Londoners were told they could join them within days. So 22 plus 9, so 31 million people are going to be plunged in the darkness. In a grim warning, Chief Medical Officer Professor Chris Whitty said he did not think even the toughest new restrictions would be enough, and it was likely that significantly more will be required in the worst affected areas. The Prime Minister yesterday ordered the closure of pubs and bars across Merseyside as he launched a three-tier system of local alert levels for England. The Liverpool City region became the first area to enter the most serious, very high risk category, and its 1.8 million residents have been advised against traveling out of the region and banned from overnight stays. Liverpool Mayor Joe Anderson accused ministers of imposing lockdown by diktat without providing sufficient support for businesses hit by the, continuing on to page 4, by the rules. But Mr. Johnson failed to convince local leaders in other parts of Northwest, Northeast and Yorkshire and the Humber, who resisted being placed under the restrictions. So there are all kinds of the human interest stories, for example, featured on these pages 4 and 5, with a tearful Paula Smith, who runs the doghouse, fears for her job. That is a tearful Paula Smith. Paula Smith is seen here on that one, that side. That is Paula Smith. And Johnson is, of course, kind of mocked here by Henry Deeds, who is the sketch writer for the Daily Mail now. His piece is headlined, "Even Boy Wonder couldn't bail out boosterless Bojo." Boosterless Bojo. That is, and then there is a picture showing Boris Johnson in deadly unhealth. And Little John has been brought forward from the later pages to page 9, pages 8 and 9. He is given the main space on the spread, pages 8 and 9, where his piece is headlined, "Driven by fear and dodgy signs, this was bound to end in tears." Tears is spelled T-I-E-R-S because of the 3 tiers or 3 levels of lockdown. That is what they're doing the pun on. Both the Richard Littlejohn piece and the Daily Mirror, which is saying that the restrictions were bound to happen and end in tears. That is a pun on the double sense of the word tears in the context of the disastrous kind of lockdown that has been imposed by the Johnson cabal. And in this one, the Daily Mirror, it all ends in tears. It says, after 8 months of sacrifice, families torn apart, millions of jobs hanging by a thread, government still has no proper plan, no proper test and trace, and no proper support for workers. And so it all ends in tears. New lockdown rules. And that is the Daily Mirror. So it's a almost unanimous series of headlines on all the papers, which in our world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street means vindicating our analysis and analytical angle that they are not original. They are imitating one another. It's like a bandwagon the Fleet Street is running. And any student of Fleet Street on issues that have been so notorious that they have become part of the kind of legend in the way that Fleet Street operates as a pack. It's not investigative, it's not original, and it's nothing to do with the impact on the people, despite the fact that today's headline is talking about the people of the north, the Humber and the Yorkshire regions and other places being affected up north and northeast. They're not talking about the people. Because most of the people in the north, in those areas that are affected and have been affected, have been credited, wrongly credited, with behaving as patriots and voting for the Johnson-fronted cabal on the 12th of December 2012, because they have understood the relative merits of a conservative government as opposed to a Labour government. And the essential conservative ideology that the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, actually believes in and has been peddling has come across in his so-called kind of remote conference, Labour Party conference spiel. And he said that any party that loses the election, an election in a democracy, deserves to. Now that is the most dishonest and stupidest kind of wisdom coming out of anyone about the 2019 election, because the 2019 election should never have happened. And a so-called forensic lawyer, the overhyped and overrated Keir, the idiot Starmer, copies somebody, because that statement is not his. Because Starmer has never been on the record in his entire career before he became an MP following Frank Dobson's disastrous exit from Holborn and St Pancras in central London. This Starmer has never been on the record anywhere as expressing anything that can be quoted. And this one has been quoted. Any party that loses an election in a democracy deserves to lose. That is the stupidest and most unrepresentative and untruthful summary of the 2012 election. Even Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government we have anywhere. But the alternative is even worse. So even Churchill acknowledged democracy as being inherently defective, faulty. Yet Starmer delivers this stupid, borrowed, somebody must have scripted this one for him. Whoever it is may not be revealed in the near future, but it is not in character. It is not the type of wisdom that Starmer has actually expressed in the last, let's say the 20 years. Let's start Starmer's biography with the role that he deliberately chose to play as a pro bono, that is not fee charging, advisor to the two defendants who had been sued for libel defamation by McDonald's. And that is one of his kind of claims to being a kind of selfless, principled licensed law trader. Now, even if we start from that one, he gave up. He abandoned them. He left them to their devices, and they had a nightmare experience of having to defend themselves against the billionaire McDonald's funded lawyers and legal harassers. And as our analysis shows, the English judicial system is corrupt. And McDonald's won. Those two defendants lost. All the evidence in the case supports that McDonald's were not defamed in the sense of their reputation being kind of unfairly, unjustly or whatever, kind of impugned or damaged or attacked. Everything those two defendants said in the leaflet against McDonald's was true, factual, and is true to this day. And Keir Starmer behaved as a vulture, as a typical licensed law trading vulture, exploiting two people that didn't have enough money to pay for licensed law traders to match the battery of batterers paid for by the McDonald's conglomerate. And what has happened in the time since he made a name for himself, that was his launching. Starmer launched himself by pretending to be the champion of the people who didn't have the money to defend themselves against the mighty McDonald's. He launched himself there. And after he launched himself there, like any opportunistic crook, he abandoned them. And he has not, Starmer has not actually revisited either the, quote, defamation industry, let alone the corrupt role of the court, English court, which is the High Court, which is the Queen's Bench Division. It's the Queen's Bench Division, which is the biggest division of the High Court, that actually controls the defamation kind of litigation. So Starmer is a servant of the corrupt, criminal, legal bureaucracies. And he has not come back, he has not visited, and he has not opined, let alone expressed a campaigning position against the corruption that is inherent in the defamation litigation system, which is completely in favor of the crooks that have the money, or the party that has the money. And there is no question asked as to what the source of that money is. So it's a built-in corrupt system, and the Queen's Bench Division is open to exploitation, which it is every sitting day, by the crooks and the cabals. And as I have said, we shall be examining chapter and verse of the Queen's Bench Division and the other parts of the court's bureaucracy in this country. Such a diagnosis in chapter and verse analysis is not available now. It shall not be available in the next decade or century, because the crooks control the bureaucracy that runs as the counterpart of the so-called academic lawyers industry or the campaigning lawyers. There are no licensed law traders who are campaigning lawyers in this country. Notice this. Licensed law trader, that is stamped with the stamp of license by any of the 4 inns of court: Gray's Inn, Lincoln's Inn, Inner Temple, and Middle Temple. These are the 4 that issue the license to trade as lawyers for barristers. And the Solicitors Regulation Authority, which is the arm or the part of the law society that actually issues the corresponding or counterpart licenses for solicitors in England and Wales and Cornwall. Now, Cornwall is never mentioned. They just about managed to mention Wales, but Wales is just an insulting reference. They don't recognize Wales as an entity, and they don't refer to it as an entity. England and Wales is like Wales is the tail, addendum, extension of England, which is historically a racist kind of arrangement, because the Welsh have got a different culture, different language, as have the Cornish. Cornish, they have almost sabotaged and suffocated out of existence. But Welsh are still there. Now, going back to the headline on the Murdoch scum, disunited kingdom, let's go to Scotland. The papers in Glasgow has got a more kind of people in there, living there, than Edinburgh. But these are the 2 most numerous or populous places. And Scotland's capital city is not Glasgow, it's Edinburgh. And Edinburgh is related to the elite kind of arrangement of the United Kingdom, as the Duke of Edinburgh kind of denotes and connotes, if you like. And in Edinburgh, there are other kind of citadels and installations that suggest that that is a capital city. And the newspapers that are published from addresses in Edinburgh are similarly more kind of elitist than their counterparts that are published from Glasgow. And the one that is most unelitist looking is the Daily Record in Glasgow. Because of the devolution and the kind of movement away from the United Kingdom identity, various things have happened in publishing as well, which includes or is evident in the fact that there are several titles that used to be kind of modeled after the London model. Most of the papers, like the Thomson Group, used to own significant parts of the share of the ownership of the papers in Edinburgh. And even now, the Daily Mirror Group owns the Daily Record, based at Glasgow. But even the papers in the Scottish kind of separate location towards independence, let's say, are still not independent in their minds and not independent from the agenda and the narrative, political agenda narrative, not party political, but political agenda, ideological agenda, and the modus operandi in terms of excluding democracy campaigners, not SNP campaigners, but democracy campaigners generally across Scotland. Of course, population-wise, Scotland is much smaller than, of course, the population of London. But the point is that it is an entity. It is kind of increasingly, every week, there is increasing findings in Scotland, across Scotland, of the Scottish kind of past. And that is what is most important in this discussion, because when that awareness reaches a point of, let's say, democratic maturity in terms of getting freedom from the attachment to the UK, they will have less similarities in their publications and their media, including the fact that the likes of daily record will become something else. They will not be part of the English arrangement or arrangement based in England or London. Now, the admission that this is disunited kingdom, of course, is a dishonest statement by this Daily Sun, because it's not thereby saying that the Scots are right and the Scottish cause for independence is worthwhile. Far from it. But the slogan is borrowed from that campaign. Disunited Kingdom, the campaign against the Conservatives, kind of over-imposing the image of England or image of their version of England on the people of Scotland. That is why the crook, David Cameron, created this completely disgusting separation of MPs' roles, that Scottish MPs cannot talk about issues in the House of Commons that are to do with English regions and English affairs. I mean, that was the death knell of the United Kingdom Parliament or United Kingdom House of Commons. Now, you are hearing this from this campaign coming to you from the East End of London, but we are leading, exclusively making this observation, because neither Alex Salmond or his successor, Nicola Sturgeon, is intelligent enough to understand the depth of racism that the Scottish people have been kind of forced to endure. And Alex Salmond is an opportunist, a small-time kind of opportunist who is now, I mean, doing small-time jobs for the Russian television and so on. I mean, he is of the league that many British MPs and politicians belong to. It's like a parasite. They are for hire by foreign kind of interests. And Salmond is one of those. And that actually shows his priorities. Salmond was not interested in a kind of genuine Scottish independence and autonomy, which is why I had to point out about 20 years ago various kind of outrageous statements against the ordinary Scottish people that were being made by Labour Party MPs, most notorious of whom was Ken Lying Still Livingstone. Salmond never made a single similar point that I had published, and I am on the record as having published, about the incitement of hatred against the Scottish people that Labour Party MPs were mouthing 20 years ago. And that is about the same time when the devolution was being launched. So that is the difference between this program, doing the diagnosis, and anything else that may be available, even from the, as I said before, University of Glasgow. The University of Glasgow has got a overhyped media school or school for independent kind of study of the media. But it is not independent at all. It is like Alex Salmond. It's like a parasite copy kind of school. And there is no original school of studying or for studying the media anywhere in this country. So it's a parasite from everywhere else. I mean, wherever there is anything that they can actually kind of pick up on the internet now and before in other ways. They can just kind of varnish and furnish and update with their stamp, which is why there is no study available, published study or theory or analysis that identifies the media in Scotland or the media that is published from Scotland or has been published from Scotland as having played a significant brainwashing role against the interests of democratic Scotland, interests of fair and just Scotland. And I mean, this is the finding, even based on the journalism of the overrated likes of the kind of, if you like, notoriety that had been associated with the Scotsman. The Scotsman had a piece about my visit to Edinburgh. What is it now? 44 years ago. And I spoke there at a rally or at a gathering organized in support of the Sikh community in Edinburgh that had been undergoing kind of a battle to defend themselves against racist attacks on the Gurdwara in Edinburgh. My speech lasted about, I was the main kind of speaker because I had been invited to go there from London and to speak against racist attacks. And I spoke for about 1 hour. And the person who reported in the Scotsman on my speech and the meeting even couldn't get my name right. He didn't even bother to ask me how to spell my name in case he was in doubt. As a journalist, I would check with the person how they spell the name if the name was not part of the general nomenclature that actually is represented in majority of the stories that an organ would publish. But he didn't check with my name, and he didn't check on the details of the incident, racist attacks that I had actually recounted in the course of my speech. Now that reporter in 1976, October 1976, actually the meeting took place on the 9th of October, I think, and the item appeared on the 10th of October 1976. So this is 3 days, within 3 days is 44 years exactly. And he got the kind of narrative about the racist attacks and the correlation between racist attacks and the causers and causing the racism and racist attacks that I had actually outlined and expanded on. Now, this guy is on the record as having been praised by his kind of tutor as the most brilliant student ever. Now, think about that. If the most brilliant student in England, because although he was Scottish, but he was actually kind of schooled in England. If he was that lax and messy and stupid, he didn't get my name right, he didn't get the facts right, and he didn't get the main contribution I made there in that speech, the analysis of racism and how to stop racist attacks. Now, 44 years ago, I was advocating universality, not Sikh or Muslim or Hindu or Christian or Buddhist. I was saying that beyond and above any faith, humanity must be actually the most important value. And I introduced the theory about free speech. I completely destroyed the argument about free speech that is deployed even now, 44 years later, in justifying racists making racist comments. And it was free speech that I actually tackled 44 years ago. And that has been vindicated many years later. And it's still not fully vindicated because the resistance by racists who occupy their positions in the media and in mainstream politics and in governments. I said freedom of speech is not freedom of speech at all. One, it is freedom to spray poison on people. It is like the acid throwers. So decades before the acid throwers came into the scene, I had anticipated them. So this is world exclusive diagnosis of the media and the politics and the establishment that school the most brilliant students of English centric kind of orientation. And we shall be continuing on that theme in due course in the later editions. Now, back to the Daily Mirror, which is the one that has got on the front page. It all ended in tears. And it says on this spread on pages 6 and 7, how the tiers for TIERS, stages, categories, groups, classifications, and 3 alert levels will show virus threat in each area and dictate which local restrictions apply. And they're running these little pieces from various areas in the detail. And there is this now, as we have been saying, for the last few months that have been coinciding with our publishing this KhoodeelaarTV Channel, the newspapers, the media are not publishing the evidence. As I said, despite the fact that they are referring to various parts, various cities in the north to emphasize the point of the north being treated with discrimination by the Johnson cabal and his announcement yesterday, they are not actually giving the details of the incidents even in those areas. So what they're doing is they're recycling one set of, if you like, news that is mainly released by the press association. Because the press association news agency, so-called, is the main vehicle to which all the kind of politicos, including the government, go. And the press association then distributes the versions that it writes up or edits. And sometimes it doesn't even edit most of the stuff that comes out of the government. And as I said before, the press association in this country is the local equivalent of the 2 or 3 dominant international agencies. One is Reuters, which is connected with very dodgy, corrupt, big business interests among its owners, and has been. And it controls. Reuters is the one that controls the vast majority of news kind of outlets operating from addresses in Africa and Asia and in the rest of the world. And most of them don't even know, and they don't even want to know, or don't have the kind of depth of interest in their so-called profession to know the actual role of the interests that own the Reuters news agency and other services and products, to use the current kind of wordings, products. It used to be services mainly, but now it is products now. Many of the things are now become products, which shows the accentuated perversion and distortion of society, which has been reduced, and the place has been taken over by marketing words and ploys. Product is a marketing word. And take it back to the housing, it says affordable housing. The crooks who mouth this affordable housing phrase are criminals who deny society and social housing, council housing, etc., etc. So the culture of the media internationally is really not diverse. It's not more than one. because the agenda peddled by the Reuters news organization internationally is the same as the one that is peddled by the Associated Press, which is the biggest news organization or news retailing organization in the USA. And in the rest of the world, and in a competition, there are three outfits. One is the Associated Press, and after the Reuters corporation or whatever, Reuters is the biggest, and then there is the AFP, the French news agency. And the French news agency is also a product or part of or consequence of the French imperialist presence in the mainly African parts of the world, in competition with the British one, which had more territories in Asia than the French. So the Reuters is actually more to do with the British imperialist kind of presence. Reuters is not necessarily originated by the British, but it is associated with the British. What I'm saying, therefore, is that whatever their origins, these are big commercial operators, and their interest is not spanning the world and spreading the word of democracy in the world. It is all these three organizations, Reuters, AFP, and Associated Press, or AP in the case of the USA, their agenda is imperialistic, neo-imperialistic, and warmongering. So therefore, what they actually emphasize and recognize, and to use a word that is used and the concept used in the kind of arrangements, access granted by government departments and governments to these agencies and their representatives, is accredit, give accreditation to. I mean, it is a big kind of symbol of status. If you are an accredited journalist, that automatically elevates your status, which is symptomatic and kind of a product of, symptomatic of and product of the corruption inherent in the whole thing, which is equivalent to the license given to the law traders by the 4-ins and the law society to trade as lawyers. Lawyers are not advocating for rights, which is what they claim to be. They are not advocating for access to fair hearing and fair tribunals and courts. They are doing all of that as part of the business. So when it comes to looking at Ofcom, which is what I referred to earlier about the Daily Mail's Paul Decker being lined up, he may not get it because there are even nastier potential candidates than Paul Decker of the Daily Mail, kind of vying for this spot as the head or the chief executive at Ofcom, the most corrupt non-regulatory regulator in being. And in the history of the kind of press council, there was a thing called press council. The press council was hyped up as the kind of regulator for printed press in this country. But it was controlled by the big newspaper owners. So it is a completely corrupt, upside down, untruthful assertion. This is why the use of the word gullibles comes in. The entire population of this country, the UK, let's say including the UK, despite the kind of disastrous behavior of the Johnson cabal in dealing with the needs of the people to be saved and safeguarded and served from the kind of virus. The newspapers, if they are owned by whoever owns the paper, they cannot be the parties to hear complaints against the newspaper's behavior. And that is what was going on for decades. I mean, Ken Morgan was one of the secretaries, one time secretary of the press council or whatever it was. And he did that because after he left the National Union of Journalists. So I knew him at the National Union of Journalists, Ken Morgan. And when he became the de facto chief of the Press Complaints Commission or Press Council, because it has similar kind of sounding names throughout the various decades, I contacted him and I condemned him for his corrupt role at the Press Council, whatever it was at the time. And Morgan, instead of writing to me the whole reply in a typed letter, he sent me a typed letter in reply to my communication concerned. He added a handwritten kind of excuse, almost pleading with me to understand his dilemma, which is exactly what most of the counselors that I have had the misfortune of knowing in the context of Tower Hamlets Council have been doing to me. Privately, they kind of plead with me to show them understanding and kind of understanding and, yes, compassion, because whenever there is a campaign against the council, these councillors get implicated in the campaign as baddies or as being failures, failing to support the community. So these councillors, if they are in contact with me over any campaign, then they said all kinds of things like I should excuse them, I should understand their limitations. And all the while what they're doing actually is kind of feathering their little nests. Feathering the nest is something anathema to me. And I believe it should be anathema to any campaigner about any issue. And it is the biggest challenge to any campaigner of any worth about anything to resist temptation. And I have been given more temptations than I can count over the decades. And the principle is I do not go anywhere near the tempters in terms of giving me a jobs or offering me some kind of whatever. So much so that I don't attend any feasts or dinners or meals with people that are remotely likely to be involved. I buy my own food even when there are meals being provided at do's, like happened in Mile End Road in 2013. The year before, Lutfur Rahman was exposed as being involved in a corrupt election in 2014. I took my meal and I ate my meal at the time of breaking the fast so that I won't have to sit with any of them and eat. Now, somebody invited me to a Labour Party shebang and kind of requested me to take part in a meal, which I did. But I absolutely made it clear that I would have to pay the money that would be the equivalent to the cost of that meal whenever I found out who actually organized this and paid for it. So that is the distance that you have to maintain between yourself and your campaign and any outfit that is doing the wrongs and is the target of the campaign and must be campaigned against. Now, how is Paul Decker going to be appropriate person to look at the media, albeit that the media is the broadcast one, television and radio? Because Decker has been an open liar and racist throughout the decades he has been associated with the Daily Mail. He's a racist liar who invented a series of lies to peddle against the father of Ed Miliband, David Miliband, Ed Miliband. Ralph Miliband was a well-regarded scholar, an activist and thinker. Nothing to do with his politics of his sons. In his own rights, Ralph Miliband was an acceptable, objective kind of observer of society in Britain. And as soon as his son, Ed Miliband, became leader of the Labour Party, Paul Decker decided to mount a series of assaults on Miliband by accusing his father, late father, of being a traitor. Miliband was not a traitor. He was a highly moral person who had serious principles compared to anything that Paul Decker has shown any capacity to have. So how can a criminal like that be treated as an impartial, objective head of Ofcom? So that is the question. And that question carries more, if you like, details and more questions than need be spelled out in this particular context, because enough is known publicly about the role of the Daily Mail as a corrupt, as a racist, hateful, untruthful publication, undemocratic publication. And this is why the headline today in the Daily Mail's front page is deceptive, because it's not really talking about the deceit by Johnson. And there is a kind of series of apparently anti-Johnson kind of articles, but they're not anti-Johnson at all. The main headline on the kind of spread on 8 and 9, pages 8 and 9, is that we will all pay for this, meaning that the disaster of the Johnson fronted cabal. And it's written by Richard Littlejohn. Apparently he lives in Miami or Florida or some place in the USA, not in North London, where he pretends to live. And we shall not read the whole of it, but that whole is not necessary to be read over. But let's just read this bit. Now, although the headline is kind of emotional, the contents, as I said already, remains strategically removed from blaming Johnson for any incompetence or disaster or bias or whatever. And this is why I wanted to read a bit of this. And here is what gives away the game, gives away the clue, the agenda that this opportunistic, corrupt, racist Richard Littlejohn is peddling and is being allowed to peddle by the current Daily Mail editor. It says, I don't know about Kool-Aid, but Boris's ministers certainly seem to have drunk the Kobe-Aid. He's saying Boris's ministers. He's not blaming Johnson at all. That is the distinction he's making. He's saying that it's the fault of the ministers, not of Johnson. Whereas Johnson is the one who appointed them all because of their loyalty to Brexit and lunacy. Now, here is Little John, who is a Brexiteer. Maybe this madness will all be over when Downing Street bursts into flames with the entire cabinet and the experts inside. Now, he's saying that the COVID kind of COVID, whatever it is going to cause an kind of explosion, and that all the ministers are going to be inside Downing Street at the time when it happens. This is a stupid fantasy, and it is a desperate attempt to create a distance between Johnson and his so-called stupid ministers. It's the stupidity is in the person of Johnson. He is more stupid than all of them put together. But that is something that Little John doesn't want to acknowledge. And then the last sentence is even stupider. All I do know is that, driven by fear and dodgy science, it was bound to end in tears, T-I-E-R-S, as the Mirror has spelled as well. It's not of any substance, any sense at all. There is no dodgy science. Science has been least dodgy, both here and in the USA. And it's the science that is keeping whatever semblance of sanity kind of appear or apparently still present in the Johnson kind of cabal's stupidity and dysfunction and lack of direction, lack of competence, and lack of actual application. The point about the North and the three tiers and the three kind of levels is not an accident. As I said before, the north of England has been discriminated against for centuries by the South. All these battles, and Peterloo in Manchester is one comes to mind, and the sacrifice of the fighters and strugglers for democracy at Peterloo 200 years ago is symptomatic of the campaigns that have been hushed up and suppressed and denied. And in the last 120 years or so of the Labour Party's existence, there has been no recognition by the Labour Party. And I say, in this context, Keir Hardie is highly overrated. Hardie may have had good intentions in kind of taking some pioneering steps in the founding of the Labour Party, but that is not good enough. If the Labour Party, when it came into process, lacked any connection, any contact with the pioneering values. And what the Labour Party should have done in the last 120 years, which covered the last pandemic as well, what the Labour Party has failed to do in the last 120 years, or let's say last 100 years, especially since the popular councillors staged that effective and absolutely principled rebellion against the Tories, penalizing the poor people of Poplar. 100 years and the Labour Party has failed. Labour Party in government and local councils as well as in central government, whatever the length of the government, let's say the Labour fronted or Labour named regimes at Westminster Parliament have failed to relate to the people. And that has meant mostly the people of the North. That is very serious and factually, evidentially undeniable evidential truth. So what the Daily Mirror is saying, that is it all ends in tears, and singing from the same hymn sheet, the parasite columnist and opinion giver Semi Thinko Richard Littlejohn echoing the Daily Mirror, it makes no sense, except it makes sense to their bank accounts because they're getting their money. But the people affected by the incompetence and the pandemonium are going to lose out, as all of these papers are saying today. That despite the fact that the chief scientific advisor has said, despite the tough measures that have been announced by Johnson yesterday, things will not get better. There will be need for tougher measures. That's the consensus. And as I said, it's a consensus relayed through the press association or central kind of broadcasting or central media operation and media kind of thing. There is no independence in the contents of the newspaper's coverage of Johnson's 3 tiers. And this is what the Guardian is pretending to be kind of less emotional. And it's saying tempers flare. This is a phrase that is overused. The 3-tier system puts Liverpool in the highest risk group and splits the country. That's what the Murdoch scum is saying. Disunited kingdom. Whitty is the chief scientific person. Whitty says measures insufficient amid anger from northern leaders. As I said, he is saying that there will be need for even tougher measures to deal with the virus. And documents reveal that SAGE, the scientific body, advisory body, advised the Johnson cabal 3 weeks ago for shorter kind of spells of the lockdown. Now, this is the main thrust of the narrative today. And what this diagnosis is saying on this is that the newspapers are not telling the truth because they're lazy and they're biased and they're complacent, and most of them have their careers, kind of the people involved are not going to get the sack or lose their jobs. So there is nothing they can lose by writing any lazy sort of thing, which is what this stuff in the papers today are all about. They are lazy stuff. They are unoriginal stuff. They are not products of investigative journalism. And despite the fact that this camera got this frozen moment, this frozen still image is absolutely accurate. Despite the fact that the Financial Times is running this image on its front page, the copy, the text of the piece do not go anywhere near kind of expressing the moral and the administrative and intellectual kind of isolation that Johnson is in now. Despite the fact that his praisers and peddlers on the Daily Mail and Boris Graf said that he has sold his copy or the book on Churchill that he apparently wrote has been translated into 30 languages and sold lots and lots of copies in the world. Now that is a stupid, racist, imperialistic kind of throwback. I mean, Churchill has been written about Churchill. There are hundreds of books about Churchill, literally, which is why the myth about Churchill still persists in this country, that he was the great savior. And there is this big denial that he was a racist, let alone the fact that he was responsible for the genocide of Bengalis in the 1940s famine he created in Bengal. So the fact that Churchill's name has been latched onto by Boris Johnson, based on the image the gullibles think that Johnson is as the image of Churchill makes Churchill come across as being wise and deep thinker and all the other things. Despite this peddling by the Mirror during the week, in the days in the lead up to this announcement yesterday, Johnson's announcement don't amount to anything. That is to say that most of the announcement or most of the package that he announced have been rejected even before the announcement, and they will be rejected because they're completely half-cooked, semi-cooked, or not cooked at all. That shows that Johnson is the frontier of the cabal that have had no interest in delivering democratic service or government to the people, which is where I say the newspapers fail, continue to fail, because that is what the evidence would have shown them if they were looking for the evidence. And it seems that the weekend's promotion of Allegra Stratton as next month's superwoman or projected superwoman that is supposed to be being groomed to play the part of saving Boris Johnson from his stupidity, it won't save, as I have said. I mean, Allegra Stratton or anybody else cannot save Johnson because it's not about his mythical personality. It is based on real delivery or absence of delivery of the democratic service that the people are entitled to, and more importantly, they are desperately in need of. If the virus is spreading, which is what they are admitting it is doing, then why is it doing? Why is it spreading? Why aren't the newspapers asking the question on the ground to the people that are delivering the statistics? Why is it happening? What are the factors that are involved? Why isn't anything working? So we shall be looking at these questions and continuing in the next editions.